Okay, I thought I would talk about the current situation, and I rarely do that, by the way. It's always kind of interesting to look at current events, and of course, the big current event that's dominated the news for the last 4 to 5 weeks is the troop buildup on the Ukrainian border. If you believe the reports, there's 150,000 Russian troops massed on the Ukrainian border in several key spots, and they have heavy artillery, all their big tanks. They brought all this fantastic array of equipment up and could invade at any moment. Now, it looks like in the last 24 hours there's been some signs of a troop withdrawal, but I'll believe it when I see it. We'll see. But it is interesting. What is Russia? What are they up to? What do they want to accomplish? And that's what I'm going to talk about in this podcast. And some of these tactics go back thousands of years, right? I mean, showing the threat of force, threat of invasion, to try and accomplish something. Usually you have some sort of objective. And Putin's not a dumb guy. He's actually very smart, and I believe he's got an end game here, and I'll talk about some of those goals. Now, one of the big ones, and these are not in any particular order, but I think one of the things Vladimir Putin wants is he wants to show the rest of the world that Russia is still top dog in that region. They're the top traffic cop. It's not NATO. It's not the U.S. It's not the UK. They want to show that they're the ones that have the power and they can use it and basically change the government in Ukraine at any time they want to. So I think that's a really huge thing. It's projection. We want to show the rest of the world that we're the top dog in that region. Now, I think another thing is I find very interesting. So he invaded Crimea, what was that, 5 or 6 years ago? I'm trying to remember. Took it over. And but he hasn't done that with the Donetsk region yet. That of course, is in eastern Ukraine where the rebels are. He hasn't taken that over and declared that for Russia. Now, I find that very curious because he could have done that, and there wouldn't have been really anybody to stop him. Why hasn't he done it? And I think the reason is he wants to just keep this whole area destabilized within Ukraine. He'd rather have that independent, but still that all the chaos that goes on right at the border. I think he would rather keep that place destabilized and keep Ukraine destabilized. So that's why I don't think he's actually gone in there. That's my guess. Now, another big reason, of course, and it's a big one, is NATO. NATO's really the one that, at least publicly, Russia has said that's a non-starter. They don't want Ukraine joining NATO under any circumstances. And it's been, if you take a look at it from Russia's perspective, they've seen all these former Soviet bloc countries join NATO. And I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, but you got Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries have joined NATO. Now, Ukraine, this is the weird thing. Ukraine actually applied back in 2008. So their application, they applied a long time ago. So it's been out there, but NATO just didn't act on it for obvious reasons. So I think that's the biggest reason that Vladimir Putin and Russia want. They want a public acknowledgement that Ukraine will never join NATO. I think that's what they're after. That's their big thing. They want a public, acknowledgement, probably from the president of Ukraine, NATO, and the U.S. to say, hey, nope, that's not going to happen. Ukraine's not going to join NATO. Because they've seen all the rest of these Soviet bloc countries join it, and from their eyes, they look like they're surrounded. And so that's probably not probably, but I mean that's obviously their biggest beef is they do not want Ukraine to join NATO, and they've said that publicly. Nope, that's not what they want. And I think one of the things is if they see all these countries adopting a Western model. Now, we know that Russia has had a very on and off relationship. I think that's the best way to say it with the West over the last 2 centuries. Peter the Great obviously was very interested in the West. He took a tour, went to France, Great Britain, adopted a lot of the culture. But since then, you would have thought maybe it would have taken off in the way that England and some of these other countries, but it really hasn't happened. In fact, they've certainly pulled away from the West. And Stalin had a great, Joseph Stalin had a great line one time. He said something to the effect, I don't know the exact line, but he said, whenever the West says something, you have to think the opposite. He had an inherent distrust of the West. And I think that, that still goes on today. Russia has an inherent distrust of the West, and vice versa. Both sides distrust each other. And the way Russia sees this, and some of the comments I've seen from some of their diplomats, is they're worried that Ukraine will basically start to become a westernized nation. And they're worried about that spilling over into Russia for sure. I mean, the border's right there. There's a lot of crossover between the two borders. And so that's the way they see it, that this could become some sort of open door policy, and the West could have a huge influence inside Russia itself. So obviously NATO's a huge item. And I think even this weekend, some Ukrainian ministers actually said, no, we're not going to join NATO at this time. You can see they're trying to avert war. And I think that's why this current de-escalation might be going on, because I think Putin wanted to see one of these ministers say, okay, no, we don't have any current plans to join NATO. They're just trying to avoid war because you got 150,000 troops on the border. I mean, that can change your opinion pretty quickly. The other thing that's going on, I think, the fourth item, so I talked about top dog in the region, keep the area destabilized in NATO. And the fourth item, final item I wanted to talk about are whenever you have a leader, of course, they're always the face of a particular country, nation, or entity, but there's always people behind the scenes that are pushing them in a particular direction. It's never simple as, so it's not just as simple as Vladimir Putin running Russia. He's got all these sides with different agendas, by the way, pushing him in a certain direction. You have some people that want peace. You have some war hawks in there, and that want war. And believe me, there are some people that I've read about under Vladimir Putin. They took over. I think things could change pretty quickly. It's kind of scary in a way. Putin's actually not quite the war hawk that people make him out to be, but there's some people under him that have a whole different, they basically want to reconstitute the whole Soviet Union. So, you always have to think about that too. What comes after Putin? It could be worse. And, this kind of reminds me of the situation back with Julius Caesar and Pompey when I think that's one of the best examples in history. When you read a lot of the ancient chroniclers, they talk about all of the people pushing Julius Caesar in this particular direction. Same thing with Pompey. Pompey is it's never just as simple as Pompey versus Caesar. They are getting pushed and pushed by all these people who want something, who have some agenda. So especially with Pompey, I think Pompey at one point made, I think jokingly kind of said something to the sarcastically that I don't even know if I have control of this army anymore. Somebody else is running me. Like all these senators, they all want something. But that's what's going on here too. I think, so what I think Vladimir Putin's doing to appease the war hawks, he can say, hey, look, I just massed 150,000 troops up there. I bullied Ukraine, and now they've got some of their ministers saying we're not going to join NATO. He withdraws, mission accomplished, he can appease them. I think there's something to that as well. Okay, thanks as always for listening.